Hello.
Hi.
You look very elegant.
Oh, thanks.
So did you get some of the service today or?
I didn't. My daughter wasn't feeling so well this morning, so we had to take her for a swab this morning.
Oi.
That was
Oh,
fun.
how old is she?
3.5.
Yeah, I remember. You know, it's sort of unremitting joy, unremitting exhaustion, unremitting terror. All these things roll together, right?
Yeah, we didn't. Neither my wife or I slept pretty much at all last night.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, she was congested and then couldn't sleep, and so anyway, I'm sure it's just a cold.
Oh yeah, but it doesn't matter. You know, especially if you're trained like you and I are, right?
Yeah.
You don't go to a cold first. You go to Tsutsugamushi fever.
Yeah.
All right. So I sent you something.
Yeah, I had crafted something sort of similar. I guess I suppose I'll start with that type of.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And then let's just look at one another, and depending on how many people join in, we can decide, do we put up that little PowerPoint? And you've got it, right?
I have it. Do you want me to do that then?
Yeah, and why don't I just, signal you, sort of say,
Okay.
hey, Jonathan, why don't we put this up and see how it goes?
Okay,
Before
let me I have it up. I'm just gonna download it.
Okay.
And let me just make sure this works. If I were to. So hold on, let me just make sure this works with you. If I.
Okay. We taking bets on how many people turn up?
Sure. What do you think?
20 or under.
Okay. All right. Does this work? Oh. Oh. Hold on. This is not want. Oh, here we go.
Bingo.
Is that okay?
Yeah, you'll just, it's in the edit view, but yes, it works.
But like in now?
Right, you've got it.
Okay, perfect. So I'll stop sharing. And now we're back into.
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, we've had some very memorable high holidays around our kids in one way or another. We had one of our two daughters was a particular challenge as a teenager. You may meet her today. She's just fine and all the rest. But she actually ran away. Yom Kippur.
Wow.
We had no idea where she was. So, yeah, parenting is quite something. That's Harry Swain from British Columbia. Hello to those who are joining. We're just going to wait a little while for other people to come in. And then Jonathan and I will start. So Lashana Tova to you for coming. To the books, did you get to the service this morning? Did you have trouble parking?
There we go.
Oh, you guys, the books are still, you should be able to unmute.
Can you hear us now?
We can, yes.
Oh, yay.
You found a parking spot?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Right in front of my house.
Isn't that something?
It's so hard to get the car in through the front door so that we could watch from the car and the television and be completely bubbled.
How about that?
You look like you're from Winnipeg.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I spent 21 years there. I'm a
Okay.
Torontonian, but we went to Winnipeg for 2 or 3 years in 1977 and left in 1999
Wow.
because we
Is
couldn't
that
cancel.
because you couldn't get a flight out?
Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask for my other half, you'll get a very different answer than you'd get from me.
Well, 10 years in Winnipeg, 2 years in Winnipeg really feels like 10 years. So
Well, on the other hand, you're cryopreserved.
that's right.
As is Winnipeg.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't change.
No, it's a remarkable community, you know.
A lot of terribly creative people have started and stayed or come back in Winnipeg. I don't understand why it was such a dense community, but it really was, especially in the theater and the arts.
You bet. And you know, diplomatic community, government leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm often asked that, and the only answer I can come up with relates to an image I have in my mind of, as I would flying into Winnipeg from somewhere on a winter evening. It's dark, and you see nothing for half an hour flying, maybe an occasional light, and suddenly there's this ball of light, almost a perfect circle in the middle of nowhere.
Huh.
That's
And
in July too, right?
well, yeah, except you see, it's not as dramatic because the days are very long. But you come in and you see this from 100 miles away because you're up in the air, and you suddenly realize the sense of isolation and how this has driven that community to become self-sufficient over more than 100 years. And there's a real sense of togetherness.
There is.
And then there's the kind of down-to-earth humility of the farm community, you know, who they live by the land. And I remember having conversations with some of my patients during one of the floods. And their property was behind a dike, but nonetheless, when you've got 6 feet of muddy, cold water, it wreaks a lot of havoc. And they would say to me, you know what, that's part of the deal. Something like, God gave us this land, it treats us bountifully, and this is the kind of price we pay, and we're very grateful for it. To those who are just coming on, we're just chatting. We're talking about my days in Winnipeg for a couple of moments, so don't think you've missed anything. We're just going to wait a little bit. So that was the real sense of the community. Then there was another part of the community where there's some people who'd been raised in the city and didn't understand this, you know, vulnerability and all the rest. And when the floods came, they really became very, very indignant and thought government wasn't managing things well, and, you know, couldn't you control the Red River and all that kind of stuff. We were there longer than planned. Our kids grew up there, and we're grateful for that experience. Yeah. So I'm sort of a Winnipegger.
It's interesting. I grew up during the time when there was a flood of people away from Winnipeg. Of my medical school class of 50 people, only 2 stayed.
So you graduated from Manitoba.
Yeah.
So I'm figuring you probably knew the person I worked for 20 years, Lionel Israels.
I knew Lionel Israels, and I really knew Brent, and still do know Brent Schachter.
As do I. I haven't talked with him in a while.
We talk frequently.
Would you please give him my regards and a Shana Tova?
I will. I'll be speaking with him on Tuesday.
All right. No, that would be wonderful. He's a fine guy. We worked together for, well, all of those 21 years. So yeah, remarkable community in its own way. The vibrance, the connectedness. it was really very special. I'm going to wait just a few more minutes, see how many people come. Some other people have joined in, I see. We actually have someone who's joined in from Winnipeg, and someone who has joined in from Victoria, British Columbia. I can see that.
Your friend Ronnie is in British Columbia. Yeah.
Hi, Marty.
Sounds like Marty is muted too.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes depending on how many people decide to join us. If it's a small group of 12 or 15, we'll probably leave it unmuted. But if it gets much larger than that, as Jonathan will explain, we'll mute and give you a chance to ask questions and unmute you, because otherwise it probably will be a little hard to manage. Yeah, I'm just getting a suggestion from the technology managers. Why don't we wait a few more minutes? So why don't we talk about our hometowns? We've now dealt with Winnipeg. Harry, what's the scene out on the West Coast? Is it clearing up a little bit?
A little bit. We could see the sky this morning for the first time in about 10 days. The smoke from the south has been just amazing.
Is the smell still profound?
Sorry?
Is the smell of smoke still profound?
No. And today it looks like a pleasant fall day. Cloudy, but you can actually see the clouds. Harvey, you're talking about Winnipeg. I recall growing up in Vancouver, how many of the leading lights of the town were transplanted Winnipeggers. Maybe they were all friends of Dr. Book.
He knows everyone.
Well, I remember sitting on an airplane one day beside a recruiter. And he was just coming out of Winnipeg, having placed someone, I can't remember in what business. And he said to me that the unique thing about Winnipeg is that in his experience, it was the hardest city in Canada to recruit into and the hardest city in Canada to recruit out of.
Yeah.
Oh, you never recruit out of Winnipeg.
Well, here I am back in Toronto. I don't know. Never is a bit of a strong word, but yeah. And the influence of Winnipeggers all over this country is really quite something. I see Dr. Ruderman, Lashana Tova. We go back a little while, I guess, Bob. Like about 50 years. 4, 8, 12, 16.
On my
I was thinking that the Hollenbergs, who were from Winnipeg, seeded a lot of medical schools from Vancouver to Toronto, and maybe even a little east.
Well, and one of them became the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine.
Oh.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary Winnipeg family. And in fact, when we moved into the home we're in now, my immediate through the wall next door neighbor was Charlie.
No kidding.
Yeah. And you know, he was running Cancer Care Ontario at the time. And so we had lots to talk about. So yeah, and then was it I'll get the names wrong. Marty became head of pediatrics, I think, in BC. And the other cousin or brother became the editor of the New England Journal. And the older brother or cousin still stayed in Winnipeg, having started the Hollenberg Clinic, and he used to drive into the St. Boniface Hospital parking lot with his Rolls Royce. Yeah, it was quite a distinguished family. Jonathan, what do you think?
I think we should probably get started. What do you think?
Why don't we? And you know, people will come in, and as we see them, we'll kind of catch them up pretty quickly.
Harvey, I've accidentally muted you. Just give me one sec. You can unmute yourself, I believe.
I've done it.
Okay.
Well, I don't want to be on video.
You're not going to be on video. I don't think you are. I can put a tape over here. That's what the video is.
Okay. Harvey, shall I start?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Give me one moment here. So Shana Tova, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this virtual learning session, Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die? The Canadian Controversy of Medical Assisted Death. I'm Jonathan Zapersky. I'm a general internal medicine doctor, as well as a clinical pharmacologist and toxicologist at Sunnybrook Hospital and the University of Toronto. So an important disclaimer is that I'm not an expert on this topic. Dr. Schipper is an expert on this topic, but however, my job at Sunnybrook involves taking care of adults who are admitted to hospital, many of which have advanced and incurable illness and are towards the end of their life. So over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been involved in the care of patients who have requested MAID, and some of whom have actually gone on to receive MAID. So I therefore have my own personal experiences with MAID over the past few years, and I'd be happy to share some of those with you during the course of this session. So I should lay out a couple guidelines to help make this run smoothly. I'm just admitting a few extra people here. The aim of this session is to learn about MAID together. People invariably have opinions on this issue. Judaism as a religion has its own opinion as well. The purpose of this session, however, is not to change your opinion or to sway you one way or another. It is really to learn and listen and learn from one another. So I will be leading the session along with Dr. Harvey Schipper. We will moderate together and would ask that if you'd like to speak, please either raise your hand, and that can be done if you go into the participants tab. You can raise your hand, and then you can speak. Or I think there's only about 20 people here, so you can essentially just unmute yourself if you'd like to talk, or if we're not getting to you, you can send me a message, either a message to everybody, or there's an option to do it as a private chat, and I can moderate the session and manage the chat function. There will be some hiccups along the way. This is a bit unusual to be doing a learning session this way, but we're going to try our best. So please bear with Dr. Schipper and I as we navigate this Zoom learning session. So I think many of you know Dr. Schipper, but I'd like to introduce him. So Harvey is the former president of Holy Blossom Synagogue. He's currently a professor of medicine and adjunct professor of law at the University of Toronto. Prior to this, he was a professor of medicine and director of the Regional Cancer Center in Manitoba and helped design cancer care programs around the world. He established the WHO Collaborating Center for Quality of Life Research in Cancer, which reframed outcome research for tumor-focused patient-centered care on a global basis. Out of a long-standing interest in the interface of medicine, law, and public policy, he has played a substantive role in issues including the tainted blood crisis, and recently in the deliberations around assisted dying as a member of the Council of Canadian Academy's expert panel on medical assistance in dying. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Schipper with us to speak and to help moderate this session on such an important issue. And so I'm going to turn it over to Harvey to start off.
Thanks, Jonathan. When Rabbi Splansky approached me a month or so ago about doing this, I had two kind of emotions. One was I was deeply moved, and I was also just a little bit intimidated. Firstly, she chose the topic, who shall live and who shall die, and assigned me to speak about it. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a dose. But the moving part of it was that of all of the public policy issues that I've been involved in a long, long time, this has been the most challenging at every level. I sat on the federal expert panel for 2 years with 41 or 42 other people who were supposedly, the world's experts, trying to navigate our way through some issues that Parliament had assigned to us, like the issue advance directives, what to do in the face of mental illness, and so on. And we deliberated long and we deliberated hard. In the course of this, we traversed the country. And never have I encountered such an amazing Pandora's box of issues that arise from what on the surface of it seemed a very simple question. So it was moving in that sense. And of course, it was also moving given that we're talking about this in the midst of a pandemic. And while getting involved in this question certainly puts your mortality in front of you, it does so kind of in the abstract. The pandemic puts it front and center, and it's not so abstract. So you put the two together, and then we decide we're going to talk about it now, Rosh Hashanah, the time of contemplation, the time of reflection, the time when I, speaking only for myself, have a kind of existential week. Who am I? Who am I with? What have I done? So I'm very moved that we're all here talking about it. There are a lot of opinions out there. There's now a very rich and rapidly growing literature about it. And often when I speak or meet with people about it, there are those who will express strong opinions from whatever position they may be in, from those who think that this should be extremely liberal to, at the other pole, those who are deeply, deeply morally opposed. So our goal for today is really to give you a bit of an oversight of how we got there. And then really, we want to hear from you, because the experience I've had is that each time I'm privileged to be part of one of these sessions, I learn something new, something surprising, often something that knocks me right off my chair. There's this Jewish notion, and not just a Jewish notion, of the fence within the fence, right? And there's some concepts where you don't attack the inner fence, but there's an outer fence around it, around which we can talk about the issue. So if it's honor thy parents, it's not that, no, we're not going to honor our parents. It's what do you do, for example, if you and your parents don't get along? What we've done with the assisted dying thing, of course, in this country is open that inner fence. And what I can tell you is that none of us, for all our effort, have anticipated the nuances, the complexity, the subtlety of issues that have arisen and that extend all the way across society. So I'm deeply moved to be here with you, as is Jonathan, and to share with you And we really, really want this to be a learning, sharing experience. So we've got a very brief PowerPoint. Can you imagine a PowerPoint on Rosh Hashanah? And we can put it up, but if anybody has any questions or thoughts at the beginning, why don't we start there? What do you think, Jonathan?
That sounds perfect to me. So everybody can unmute themselves if they want to speak.
All right. What do you think, Jonathan? Anybody, do I see a hand up? Is it Marty who's putting a hand up? I couldn't tell.
I don't see a hand, but
Oh, okay.
No, sorry, Harvey. We're here, we're listening. We're also eating lunch, so we don't want to be rude and eat in front of everybody, but we're watching and I'll put a picture of me and apologize for the rudeness.
Well, put up a picture of the dinner.
Well, hang on a second. I'll get some art going here.
All right. Okay.
How did this?
All righty.
so Harvey, do you want me to put up
Why
the
don't we
PowerPoint?
put up a little PowerPoint just to set it in context? You can imagine those of us who've been involved have given many lectures and written many papers about this, and you may have seen in the little write-up on the synagogue website, there's a link to some of the stuff I've been involved in if you want to go to.
Harvey, how's that? Can you see the screen?
Can everybody see that? And you want to put it into, there it goes. So let's go back to about 5 years ago when the ground shifted. Next slide. For many years, the issue had been raised in the legal system. Is there a way that we can ease the suffering of some groups of patients whose suffering is unbearable by actively ending their lives? We've long established the principle, of course, that anyone can say, thank you, I don't want any more treatment. And the basis of palliative care has been to relieve suffering, but to relieve suffering short of actively going about with intent, ending someone's life at a given time and place. About 15 years ago, this case came before the Supreme Court in Canada, and in the Rodriguez case, the court did not allow assisted dying, and the vote was 5-4. And over the years, I've had conversations with a couple of the Supreme Court judges who were involved in that decision on both sides. And they said that was the most difficult, vexing decision of their legal careers. Rodriguez and Carter and the people associated with the later case were people who had a really nasty, untreatable neurodegenerative disease. To put it coarsely and simply, these were people with fine minds trapped in terribly constrained bodies. And they just couldn't see carrying on that way. Life was too much suffering for them. Why did the court swing in its opinion from Rodriguez to Carter? Well, society, I suppose, had changed, but the other important part was a novel legal argument. And that argument was that if I don't have access to someone able to end my life, and I see myself gradually deteriorating to the point where I can't do it myself, then I'm going to have to end my life earlier than I would otherwise end it. And that legal nuance is what led to the Carter decision from about 5 years ago. And here's what the court said. For a competent adult, and the bold letters are my addition, who clearly consents, and one sec, my screen is slightly obscured here. Just give me a moment. But you can read this. Who clearly consents little technical glitch. Who clearly consents to the termination of life and has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, including illness, disease, or disability that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. So the bolded words are the key words. And what will become apparent, and what has been a deep fascination and vexation for me and all of us all along, is that while in the legal frame, each of those bold words is clear, at the clinical bedside, as a physician, each of those words is undefined and ambiguous. The court gave the government of Canada a period of time in which to create legislation to make this happen. They said, if you don't do it, we're simply going to vacate the criminal code, because this created a hole in the criminal code, an opening where actively ending someone's life was no longer murder. That's what we're talking about. So out came something called Bill C-14. And you may recall that it was delayed by an election and a lot of back and forth. But the next couple of slides will show what Bill 14, which is the current legislation, shows. Jonathan? So this is basically the Carter decision. They have to be adults. They have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. The request has to be voluntary and not made as a result of external pressure. And they have to give informed consent immediately prior to the event. And they have to have capacity to make that consent. And of course, they have to be Canadians. On the next slide, you'll see a nuance that has been very controversial and has led to subsequent legal action. It's item D. Their natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. It acknowledges that we physicians don't always get it right, but this was not in the Carter decision, but it was put into the bill, and this was not without controversy. More recently, legal action has been brought in Quebec that has argued that that clause is unconstitutional in the sense of violating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That, if you will, it prejudices against the disabled. And those who may have a major illness, they're disabled, their death is not reasonably foreseeable, they, if you will, are constitutionally discriminated against. And the argument was made based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that that was unconstitutional. And a single judge in Quebec agreed with that position in a judgment called Trichon a few months ago. And she has given the Canadian government initially 3 months and now some extensions for other reasons to revise that legislation. to take out the reasonably foreseeable clause. Next. So before we open it up, I'll give you a sense of some of the kinds of conditions for which assisted dying has been provided, and in these cases with substantial publicity. John Shields was a fellow who lived out in BC. His story was featured on the front page of a Sunday edition of the New York Times. And basically he had a severe immunological disease called amyloidosis, which among other things causes major cardiac problems, and had run into other difficulties. He was bedridden in a hospice, and he just couldn't bear this ongoing life anymore, and he could see the impending end as his cardiac function became worse and worse, and he can do less. And he requested, was approved, and received what we call MAID. Next. This case was front page news in the Globe and Mail at the beginning of last year. It was a couple in their 90s. They lived in Toronto. They'd been married for a very long time. She had severe rheumatoid arthritis. He was well. They wished to die together on their own terms before one or another became seriously ill. In fact, when they first sought approval for medical assistance in dying, one of them was turned down. He was, because he was well. He subsequently developed some atrial fibrillation, which was quite common in people beyond age 65 or 70. And on that basis, they were granted approval. And they actually announced this fairly broadly, had a large community gathering some weeks before. The day before, they had a closer family gathering, and they received their assisted death together the following morning. The legal rationale was their death, given that they're in their 90s, was reasonably foreseeable. Next one. This is a much younger woman, Julia Lamb. She's concerned because of her progressive neurological disease, for which we don't have, a restorative treatment at this point or in the immediate horizon. Her death isn't reasonably foreseeable. She could go for 10 or 15 or 20 or 40 years, and she just doesn't want it. She does not want a life of that kind of disability. Next slide. Here's a bit of the lived experience we've had. There have been 13,000 Canadians who have received assisted dying since Bill C-14 was promulgated. We don't have very much data at all about the real nuance of their cases. But the Archie Rowland case from Quebec raises some of the concerns that are out there. He had a neurodegenerative disease and was in a Montreal institution doing quite well, a little bit like Stephen Hawking, for many years. And for administrative reasons that were never made clear, he was arbitrarily moved to another institution that didn't provide the support. After lobbying intensely any which way for a period of time, he was unable to get the support that he had previously had. He requested and received MAID. Next. One of the other nuances in the story has to do with what the court said about the role of health providers. Health providers, of course, live in one way or another by something called the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath basically says one preserves life. And the court said that for physicians who are conscientious objectors to this, they cannot be compelled to do it. And it's for, if you will, the legislative or regulatory systems to provide an avenue so that this conflict of interest could be resolved. And it's been resolved in some provinces better than in others. But that's one of the inherent conflicts, because it does, in the eyes of many, change the role of the physician. As Rob Buckman, who some of you may know, has said, he's an eminent palliative care physician, and until recently just stepped down from a term as president of the Canadian Medical Association. And he says, you know, this has subtly changed palliative care from our obligation to relieve suffering and preserve life with dignity and freedom from suffering to doing what the patient wants. And it's a subtle change that we haven't quite sorted out yet. Next. We are the first common law country to legalize assisted dying. There are a number of jurisdictions in the United States which have legalized it, but what's interesting for most of them, there are about 6, California being the most recent, as I understand. There you are granted permission to receive a supply of medications which you self-administer to end your life. There are a number of European countries that have had this, but not in a common law, administrative law, but rather in an administrative law setting. And to set it in context, laws of any category that permit assisted dying are in force representing approximately 3% of, if you will, the Western world. So Canada is very, very much at the cutting edge of this. And there's a great deal of learning we need to do, which is why sessions like this with you are so moving and deeply helpful. Next. When I give talks about this, I often get into the discussion of the difference between legal and medical reasoning. And reflecting back on Supreme Court decisions, many of these are bellwether decisions that herald where a society is going. And they're looked back on many, many years later for their impact way beyond the narrow confines of the particular case in question. There's a famous American one from 1857 that's pretty pertinent now called Dred Scott, in which the Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the judgment that said, an American Negro is worth 1/3 of a white, and therefore, you know, their rights are seriously constrained. In Canada, we had a remarkable decision called Dry Bones in 1970, which started finally to change the relationship between our First Nations population and the rest of the community and put it on a somewhat more equal basis. And of course, all of us know about the Morgentaler decision in 1988, which basically said that it vacated the criminal offense against abortion. And since Parliament would not take up dealing with the issue, of course, that's now been left in the hands of the profession. I think we're going to look back on Carter over the years, and it's going to be one of those bellwethers. And the question really is what we make of it and how it shapes our society and our thinking and so on. So that's a brief overview. And now, with the greatest of respect, it's really over to you. We'll be deeply interested in your thoughts, your reflections, and we'll learn together.
It's hard to jump into a conversation like this because I think we all feel fairly tentative. I have 2 living parents. My father was 101 and my mother is 99. And I wish I could let them go, because they can't speak and they can't move and they can't experience pleasure. They have to be helped with everything. And both my parents have always been fiercely independent. Reasonable expectation of death soon, yes, but tomorrow, no. I would like to be in a position where I could help them let them go. And I'm not.
And you're not because, just to clarify, and we can then go further.
Well, so far, no one has been around, or I am not aware of anyone who can assist me in this process.
So you're right.
So I wait.
Yeah. And the law says very clearly, no one can act on their behalf.
That's right.
And it's one of the issues, I have to tell you, that we've struggled deeply with, certainly on the expert panel. Because in part, one of the issues is, who are we, how are we to ascertain their level of suffering, their level of cognition, what they're experiencing, what their happiness is? And those who, like you, would like to help say, well, not to put words in your mouth, I'll take that risk because I know them well. Mm-hmm. And there are others who have said, well, I've seen older people and they smile and they seem content. They are not the people they were before. Who am I to judge? And there's obviously no objective scientific answer to that one. And it's a deep, deep dilemma. Yeah.
Certainly my mother has expressed her wishes to me very clearly. My father, not so much, but my mother for certain. I know what her wishes are.
So one of the interesting things, I'm not a palliative care, I've been deeply involved in palliative care over the years. I am not a MAID assessor, and I am not a MAID provider. Mm-hmm. But by virtue of the color of my hair, it seems, I get pretty frequent phone calls or emails asking for a bit of guidance through this. And about 3 weeks ago, on Tuesday and then Wednesday and then Thursday, I had 3 calls that kind of illustrate the spectrum of issues. And the first one was from the family of a 94-year-old man whose wife had been living with severe Alzheimer's for a number of years and basically recognized no one. Yeah. Whose older brother had died of Alzheimer's, and he had recently been diagnosed with early Alzheimer's. And his physician had said to him, you can't access MAID because you've got Alzheimer's. The reality is actually slightly different. And it has to do with one's capacity to consent. And one of the fascinating things that we learned in this whole exercise is that there is precious little knowledge, literature, experience about one's capacity to consent in the face of intolerable suffering. Remember, intolerable suffering is part of the criteria. So just as a mental exercise, imagine you're lying by the roadside and you've just been hit by a truck and it hurts really badly, or you're having a myocardial infarction, okay, a heart attack. And someone comes up to you and asks you a complicated consequential consent issue. Are you capable of making the kind of nuanced decision in that frame? And there's no literature about it. But if you contact in Ontario, there's a MAID access phone number, then they will send assessors whose obligation, supposedly, is to look carefully at someone's capacity to make the decision at hand. And clearly you need a different kind of capacity to decide whether or not to have coffee in the morning than to end your life. But this is one of the interesting legal medical distinctions. Legal capacity is like a light switch. You've either got it or you don't. Medical capacity is a spectrum. And those of us who are at the bedside do this all the time. So what I would say to you is you can actually explore that. And it depends really on that person's capacity at the time. And clearly it's not black and white tick box. It's tough.
So many people in this position, often they may have the capacity, but are unable to communicate that capacity in a fashion that would be recognizable to a lawyer or a legal system.
You're right. And that's what the struggle, that's part of what the struggle really is.
I wanted to jump in here from a psychoanalytic perspective, and I'm not asking you to believe anything I'm saying, but I'm asking you to kind of think about it. I want to pick up on what Dr. Schipper just talked about, the capacity to make decisions concerning the patient who is suffering and wants help in ending his life. I'm interested in what draws physicians to want to take on this role. In particular, what unconscious factors or mental processes are active that they're unaware of, but that they are putting themselves in that position to make these kind of life or death decisions. Because there is more and more literature that's coming out that shows undoubtedly that all human beings make decisions for reasons of which they are completely unaware. There's studies of physicians and how they treat white patients and black patients, and it's clear they, as a group, are biased against black patients. And these are retrospective and prospective studies, and so I'm raising that question because I'm suggesting people who choose to do this kind of work may be pushed into it for reasons about which they have no ideas. Give you one other example, because it's an example that comes to mind. I can't prove it, but I've always felt that Dr. Morgenthaler, who I believe was, or whose parents were concentration camp survivors, dealt with his experience by identifying with the Nazis and having fetuses murdered. But he doesn't use those terms. He talks about abortions. Just like in the first two slides you showed, Dr. Schipper, the word killing does not appear. Why? It does not appear because it just tears us apart, not because it's inaccurate.
Does someone want to respond to that, Rose? I saw you light up. I'm not sure whether that meant you wanted to respond.
It's nice. It's nice to see Dr. Book. I haven't seen him for a long time. So, and I'm always very respectful of everything he says. But I would be reticent to talk about unconscious motivations, even though I believe there's some truth to what he said, and this being Rosh Hashanah, and many of us being Holocaust children, you know, we can identify very well with what he's saying. But I think it's a dangerous road to attribute unconscious motivation in a situation like this, because you'll have very few people who really understand what you're referring to or the pathway that leads to that. But the reason I put my hand out, and I'd like to hear your response to what Howard had to say. I'm very interested in your comment that the Supreme Court is a societal bellwether, and that you gave examples of Dred Scott and Dry Bones and Dr. Morgenthaler. How does your committee see this particular legislation as a bellwether, and a bellwether for what? Where do you see the society going as reflected by this particular legislation? There's two things. It's Dr. Book's comment and also the second one that I just asked.
So you're asking me, Rose, Harvey?
Yeah, I always ask you everything. You know that.
Yeah, well, and you never ask simple questions.
Well, those are boring, right?
Yeah, right.
There she is.
So
Here I am. I was eating, and Marty said it was rude, so I took off the video.
So the bellwether is my phrase, and it's a retrospective kind of thing.
Yeah.
In other words, we'll look back on the decision in that sense. There's a lot of argument about whether, courts with their powers actually represent, in a sense, the values of society better than the legislature. And there's a whole school of argument in Canada about the so-called conversation between the legislature and the courts about what represents society. In my view, and I'm not a lawyer, despite being an adjunct law professor, it's a legislative issue, and it's the legislature with our democratic representation that is the closest representation of what society thinks with all of that, of its failings. Now, one of the issues in this particular topic is that the legislatures want nothing to do with it. At one point, I interviewed a whole pile of people, including 2 or 3 prime ministers and some premiers and, healthcare providers and students and all the rest. And I had a conversation with one, the politicians all said the same thing. And it was summed up by one past prime minister who said to me, Harvey, if that football landed on my desk, I would punt it, and I would punt it far. And what happened in the Quebec decision, where a single judge moved to expand the eligibility of this, was that the governments on neither side wanted to intervene. They just lacked the political will. And as the same prime minister said to me, there are no votes in this. So it's a very difficult thing. So the bellwether notion is mine, and what it has done, and the reason I wonder if we're going to look back at it in the next 20 years, is that it actually allows the active ending of life, and it's the only part of our legislation that does it. We took out the death penalty because we were afraid we would be wrong, apart from its brutality and all the rest. And we removed the criminal sanction against suicide, acknowledging it was a medical problem about 40 years ago. And now we've opened a window, which then goes to your next question and Dr. Book's comment. It's a painful and vexing question for me, because I know a fair number of maid providers, and my own perspective on a maid provider, and I, as a matter of age and stage and conscientious objection, I will not be a maid provider or an assessor. But my own perspective is they should come into that conversation with the ending of life as a last resort option of all the things that may be there to relieve someone's suffering. And I know many of them, and they think about it that way. But I also have encountered others who have said, this is a very holy role. To relieve suffering in this way is an extraordinary gift and obligation. There's a kind of moral passion about it that actually makes me a little bit nervous. And you may not know, but in Canada, MAID providers are self-selected. There's no training program. There's no evaluation program. And unlike any other medical procedure, there is no retrospective, case review of what we have done. And there are other physicians in the room who may want to reflect on this, but I don't know of any medical procedure ever introduced, procedure or intervention, where sometimes we didn't get it wrong. And we learned by, whether it's morbidity and mortality rounds or other things, we don't have that in place yet for this. And so we're not learning about exactly the issues, Rose, that you raise. Do I think there are, if you will, Nazi-like murderers out there? Oh, I think the odds are damn small. But there may be people who, with the best of intentions in a sense, are making the wrong decisions. But I don't know. And I think we need to know. Rose, I hope that helps a bit.
Yes, I think what you're saying, Harvey, if I'm understanding you correctly, is the bellweather is we're going down an ethical bad road. You explained why you felt that way, because those examples you gave were clearly ethical nightmares. The Dred Scott, where an American Negro is only worth half a white person. In retrospect, we can see clearly how negative that was. And what I hear you saying is that when we look down the road and we look retrospectively on this particular act, it's also going to be negative because of some of the issues that you've raised. One of them is I'm always very nervous about anything legal or medical that has a moral passion attached to it. It makes me nervous in general. But anyway, that's what I'm hearing you say. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to be negative, but what I'm saying is it's going to be something. We may as a society have figured this out and turn out to be very comfortable with it. And, it has eased a lot of suffering and we'll look back on it and say, difficult, contestable, whatever you want to call it at the beginning, it seems to have turned out okay. The drum, as some of you who know me know, I beat every opportunity I have, is darn it, we've got to look closely at our experience before moving on. And we're not.
Harvey, there's a question here from Paul K that I'll read so everybody can hear it.
Okay.
As long as that's okay, after 3 new grandchildren, we are in the process of updating our wills. What language do we use to admit the possibility of MAID? With legislation and interpretation rapidly changing, following Linda's predicament, what can the person holding power of attorney who understands the person's wishes do? So this is a really interesting question because, and I'll start off because as it stands now, to make a request for MAID or to be assessed for MAID and to ultimately go forward, you have to have capacity, as Harvey mentioned, at the time of the procedure. And capacity, as Dr. Schipper mentioned, changes and it depends on the decision at hand. So capacity can change from one day to the next. So you could be deemed capable of making a decision to move forward with MAID on a Monday, but potentially not capable of moving forward with that decision on a Tuesday. And just from personal experience, I can tell you that in situations that I've been involved in, there is an option to expedite the process. Typically, after an assessment is made, there's a 10-day reflection period prior to the procedure being performed. And sometimes in the situation where we believe that the patient may lose capacity over those succeeding 10 days, we waive that reflection period, or a decision is made to waive that reflection period for the fear of losing capacity. But as it stands now, nobody else can make that decision for you. And this is a very controversial issue. And you can't put this into your wishes. At this point in time, you cannot put this into your wishes to be carried out in the future. With the idea being you have the capacity now to make the decision, and perhaps in 10 years' time, you may lose that capacity, but you would like it in your will. That is not currently allowed under the letter of the law. And Harvey can correct me if I'm wrong.
You're exactly right. There is no provision that you can put in your will that will allow for MAID under current legislation. Now, I'm going to step way beyond my adjunct professor of law qualifications here to say, I can imagine you're putting in your will, some kind of statement that says, in the event that the rules of the land allow this kind of advance directive, then under such and so conditions, that's what we would wish. But and I'm not a lawyer, and so don't go running off doing it without checking. But that strikes me as a reasonable kind of thing to do. I, for a period of time, chaired the panel that was addressing this whole advance directives thing. And I stepped down from that chairmanship in the midst of a bit of politics. But we realized that the advance directive thing is a very, very difficult issue, because it assumes that your thinking now is similar to what it may be further down the line. It assumes that the people who would decide on your behalf are uncomplicated, unfettered by conflicting interests of one sort or another. We went up and down and around and about on this one and realized that every time you proposed an answer, you came up with a nuance that made it, difficult again. Let me cite another example that I've now seen, and that is where someone receives approval for MAID. And particularly in the case where, they're getting on, they've got a few disabilities, but it's not as though it's like Julia Lamb, the one with the neurodegenerative disease, or like the majority of patients who are really at the end of their life with severe heart disease or cancer, but are people who are older and feeling isolated. And by the way, COVID has made this worse. There's no question it's made it worse for older people. But then they find themselves with the ticket in their hand. And it creates, for some people, a torment of its own. Do I do it today? Do I do it in 6 weeks? I've got this ticket. And I can tell you, having spent 2 years with the experts, with a group of experts, that one never crossed our minds. Which is this story of, every conversation I have, there's a new nuance that comes out. So that's what I might write in the will. But if you take my advice, I go to jail. Other questions or thoughts?
I have a question. I'm a long-term care physician,
Yeah.
and I have many patients who are so cognitively damaged that really the only thing that exists is their heart and their kidney and their lungs. And I wonder if I were to develop dementia, if I wouldn't want to end my life earlier than I might otherwise, because I don't have capacity to say under a particular set of circumstances where I have no cognitive function, I would wish to have made. And it seems to me that's sort of the Carter tweak that you were talking about at the beginning. And so really my question is, do you think there will be a possibility that the courts will intervene to allow those of us who wish to be able to make an advance directive that's very specific, whether that'll come into force sometime in the next few years? Thank you.
Everybody want to make their Yontif bets? You raise two issues. One is that very specific one, Stephen.
Yeah.
And the other is, where does medical decision and medical epistemology, medical thinking and reasoning end, and where does legal reasoning begin? Because they're very different. I knew that, I thought, until I got involved in this issue directly and realized that there are two ships passing in the night. That the same words mean profoundly different things to lawyers and doctors. And where this played out most dramatically, actually, in those expert panel sessions was in the one about mental disorders, where the lawyers said this is straightforward and the clinicians just couldn't buy it at all. And it was a passionate and sometimes more than passionate impasse. The reason this has been driven by the legal system has to do with the nature of the Canadian Bill of Rights. All right, the statute, the statute. And the statute is built on a particular concept of autonomy, individual autonomy. I am the master of my life. I am independent of all others in that thing with very narrow constraints. When we sit around Holy Blossom, for example, we live in a world of relational autonomy. The whole thing is built on the notion that we are not just individuals ourselves. And so in trying to drive this forward, the advocates, by the way, many of whom are members of our faith community, use the legal argument because they understand that at a political level, it won't fly. So they're using the individual autonomy argument to drive it. So the question becomes, to what point will that individual autonomy argument be sustained? Because the same charter puts limits on it to say, well, wait a minute, it does butt up against societal values, Section 1, I think it is. And the courts haven't expressed that yet, but a lawyer friend of mine, after the Truchon decision, which said, hey, this disadvantages the sick, therefore we'll allow it, said, well, wait a minute, we could make the same argument and say it disadvantages the healthy, let the society provide MAID for anyone who wants it. So that's a woolly answer that I'm giving you, but I think it's the best I can do.
Well, thank you for the answer.
Any other?
I have a kind of a follow-up question from your mention of the advisory committee talking about the mental illness and mental health considerations. And if there was discussion or what discussion there has been around sort of differentiating between wanting to die as suicidal ideation and that being the issue that needs to be solved, and wanting to die because of intolerable physical suffering. My question, coming from my experience with people who are suicidal, who would in the same way describe that living is absolutely intolerable, but our approach tends to be to help them fix that. So has there been discussion kind of about how you differentiate that or how you approach it, or if the approach first is to try to help someone want to live through, psychological or psychiatric interventions, even when there's an obvious physical reason for their suffering?
So you raise a very important and subtle distinction. The reluctance to get involved in providing aid for people with mental disorders was framed around people with mental disorders where that was the sole illness, if you will. So in other words, if someone, for example, has end-stage renal disease or something like that, and they're also depressed, they can apply for MAID under the current rules in the context of the renal disease. It still begs the question, of course, of whether or not you've paid sufficient attention to relieving the mental suffering that may be associated, but they have an avenue. The issue becomes those for whom the illness is purely mental. Someone who, say, is schizophrenic, is bipolar, whatever. And the concern there is, from the psychiatrists who know this far, far better than I do, so Rose, you may want to comment. Our knowledge of the trajectory of psychiatric illnesses is not that good that we feel, if you will, comfortable saying they're never going to get better. And linked to that is the difficulty, of course, that some of the parts of a mental illness include a reluctance to accept treatment that one knows works for all its imperfections. So, and the third gets into the definitions of mental illness, and that is a very societal construct. And among objections raised is, of course, the experience in Germany and other places where the definition of mental illness, mental defectiveness, has, if you will, cultural and political dimensions. And just as a sidebar, it's bioethics 101 in this topic to talk about the experience in Germany in the second, in the Nazi days. But one of the things that people don't realize is that the German authorities got the concept, the framing, the wording, the regulations, and the shaping of the legislation for their eugenics policies from the state of Illinois, where a very active eugenics movement, which grew up in the United States in the 1920s, was shaped into law in Illinois. And so when people sort of say, hey, it ain't going to happen here, sometimes you've got to remind them, on whatever side of the argument you are, that, well, in a kind of way it did, So at least that's a long-winded, woolly academic answer. I hope it helps a bit.
can I jump in here with a
Yep.
perspective? And I'm speaking as a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
I would think that somebody who is suffering to the point where they desire help in ending their life, somewhere along the line would have a psychiatric workup. I'm speaking generally. Why? Because in the situation you talked about where somebody's in acute renal failure and wants to die and has a depression, the depression is treatable. And I think just focusing solely on the physical aspect is not good medicine. It should be a biopsychosocial somatic approach. There are cases where somebody's physical illness is driving their wish to die, and there are no signs of depression. And so there maybe you might move to looking at the role the kidneys are playing. But with something like suicide, assisting that, I would say, and I'm interested in what Rose would say, it's almost mandatory that before the process moves too far, there's a psychiatric diagnosis, looking for a psychiatric diagnosis should occur, not because people are crazy to want to die, but they may have something that's treatable. And I would not want that to go overlooked.
Harvey, is it, I'm going to let Nancy and David jump in a second, but is it mandatory? I don't know if it's mandatory, but at most centers now we have assessment teams. We certainly do at Sunnybrook. Many of those on the assessment teams are psychiatrists, and their role is to not only perform a capacity assessment, but also to perform an assessment to make sure there's not an underlying mental illness that's driving some of this. I don't know if that's mandatory though, is it?
It's not. We're in the early days of learning about this. And as I say, go back to my drumbeat, that's some of the learning we really need to do, and we haven't been. And if I were to ask people to join a campaign, I'd say, hey, help us learn more about this for exactly that kind of reason. It's not mandatory now.
Nancy and David wanted to jump in, so I'll let them jump in, and then Marty Cutler had something to say as well, I believe.
Just a quick question, Harvey, just because this isn't simple enough. You've outlined a Venn diagram with medical and legal. If we add another circle and add spiritual, we're here on Rosh Hashanah. What would you say about the spiritual input into this discussion? I mean, there's been lots of discussion about the ethical difficulties. There's no question about the ethical difficulties. Can you speak about some of the spiritual or faith community contributions to the discussion?
Yeah, and this will, I suppose, come a little close to a personal polemic. For me, one of the serious disappointments of the process thus far has been the exclusion by several means of the faith communities. They've self-censored. And for example, on the Council of Canadian Academies thing, we had doctors, we had psychiatrists, we had lawyers, we had policymakers from, I forget, 10 countries, whatever it was. And there was no voice from a religious organization. And toward the end of the process, someone said, what about the spiritual views of our indigenous communities? Because we're very sensitive to this issue now. And lo and behold, we had two Indigenous representatives on the panel. One was an anesthetist who I came to know quite well, and he's a wonderful guy. And he said, yeah, let's get some elders around. And so they got a group of elders around, and a subgroup of, this broader panel met. And the elders expressed a kind of consensus religious view, making clear that there isn't a single view, right? And that view was, we shouldn't be doing this. The faith communities have not expressed their view. I remember having a conversation with one faith leader, not of our faith as it turned out, who had basically been told, because of the connection with a major health institution, that if that view were publicly expressed, the institution would likely be taken over by government. So my view is the spiritual view is hugely important, and not because it's Rosh Hashanah, but because it is a point of view that's as legitimate as any other. I mean, this is a very secular approach to the end of life. Does it meet legal criteria? Do you have bad kidneys? Whatever it is, it's a very secular, individualistic approach. And I'm not sure that, well, I'm sure that I don't want to build a case for absolutely banning it because some religious group says it compromises our moral principles, but the voice has not been adequately heard. Now, having said that, I've had conversations within a number of faith groups, including with the Toronto Board of Rabbis. And there is no question, for example, that our Orthodox co-religionists have no room for MAID. But what I can tell you is within the conservative and reform communities of where membership from that Toronto Board of Rabbis comes, there is quite a diversity of opinion, and they are strongly held views all the way across. I think that should be out there. And, someone put it to me very well a while ago when they said, you know what? I have my ticket in my hand. I've been approved. This is too big a decision for me to make. This is, and this was from a person who's not profoundly religious, this is a higher power kind of decision. And that was one of those surprising moment things in sitting talking with people. In the abstract, it sounds easy. In the moment, for many, it may not be. And I think that countervail to the very secular approach at the moment is worth having. One clergyman said to me, I feel we have been shamed into silence. It was another surprising kind of interchange. Marty, did you?
Yeah, pardon me. Harvey, you talked about Dr. Sandy Buckman and the process that's gone from relief. So you talked about Sandy Buckman, and can you hear me?
Sort of.
Now, Harvey?
Go for it.
No. Okay, so you talked about Sandy Buckman and a bit of the process of going from relieving suffering to the patient having more of a say in things. So the MAID legislation presents both an opportunity for patients to have a say in their outcomes, but also a limitation. And I guess my question is that a problem? And is there opportunity, given all of the limitations and qualifiers and risks that everybody's been talking about, to giving the patient more power? That was God, physician said going to do. Now we've come a long way from that point of the physician being God. Here's your treatment, you take it. The patient never questioned it. So I'm wondering if there's still too many limitations in the legislation and the exercise of MAID, and should that be addressed pointedly?
We were breaking up a bit, so let me let me repeat your question to see if I understand it first. And that is, with this legislation, we've included more the patient's perspective and a further shift away from the notion of the physician as having the total say, the total responsibility. And is that a good thing? And can we do this while allowing, you know, safeguards, if you will? Have I got that more or less right?
Yes, you do more or less, but so, and I clearly understand the role of government and the role of the medical community and the role of the religious community, all of the inputs. But in the bottom line here is that it's my life, it's the individual's life, and putting aside under 18 and the questions that entails, or putting aside the important questions about mental illness, should there be more power for those who are awake and aware and competent to have more power in that decision? And is that such a bad thing?
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. And, you know, one of the fascinating misunderstandings out there, and this is a bit of an aside, I have been astonished by how often people who follow the issue, if you will, are well educated, all this kind of stuff, have the misunderstanding that this is about the right to refuse ongoing care. The number of times people have said to me, look, I just want to have the right to turn off my dialysis machine or not have more cancer treatment, as if the assisted dying thing was addressing that. And that, of course, has been an established principle for a very, very long time. And I am repeatedly struck by how often that misunderstanding comes to play. When we come to the active ending of a life, it is a little bit different, I think, Marty. I think for darn sure, you're not doing it without someone's approval. The question is, in my mind, have you, as the caregiver, provided the broadest, most comprehensive opportunity to relieve the suffering? You know, I've talked with physicians who were first very much opposed to this and then found themselves in the role of doing it and said, you know, I went very carefully. Here's the story of this particular patient. We talked about it at great length. The family was involved at great length. It was a holistic decision. It was carefully considered. It was consistently held. We tried all manner of other things, and it just wasn't going to work. If you're going to do that, then I think there are grounds for this. And, you know, I've often said, whatever the fact of my not being an assessor, not being a provider, and have written a fair bit of cautionary stuff. I don't know what's going to happen to me down the line. All right. And there's a certain, if you will, Rosh Hashanah humility that comes from saying, I really don't know where I'm going to be down the line. But I would certainly hope that before acceding to my request to end my life, you really understand me, and we understand that there is no viable, feasible, if you will, way to provide for my dignity and for my suffering. And I've had enough experience around this to know that we're a little bit relaxed about that. We just don't know. And I do have that concern. Did I see your hand, Rose?
Yeah, I just wanted to just follow up a little bit on some of the concerns that have been raised about mental health, and also to comment on what you've just said in a very personal way. One of the central tenets of this bill, C-14, is the issue of capacity. And we kind of go over that relatively easily, because I know Jonathan mentioned there's psychiatrists on all these committees, but there is very little knowledge about how to assess capacity. And it's done depending on who's doing the assessment. There are some people who assess capacity because they've had experience with it. Some people who are asked to do it because we need someone to do it. But there's very little guidance in the literature or standardized approach. Now, if you marry the issue of capacity to intolerable suffering, I don't know who's going to assess capacity and you have any kind of support or any kind of credence in it. Now, one of the issues that we've raised is the mental health issue. Just because you're a psychiatrist doesn't mean you know anything about capacity. And people make an assumption that because we're in the mental health field that we should understand capacity. So I'm just making a pitch that as we move forward with this bill, a lot more attention be given to how we assess capacity, what the criteria are, can we standardize it in some way? We don't have to make it rigid, but we need some guidelines. And then we can look at the assessment of capacity in the face of intolerable suffering, which is another step in the understanding of capacity. Now, mental health is, it is a medical condition, but it's in a category a little bit by itself. We don't have the scientific knowledge of mental health that we do in medicine. We have some knowledge, I don't want to play it down, but it's not the science that we hope that medical conditions are. So I'm just kind of always concerned every time we have these conversations that we make an assumption that people know how to assess capacity. Some people are better at it than others, but as I'm repeating myself, we really have to give some attention to that, and especially people who become assessors of MAID, that at least they have to have some training or some understanding or something. And the last point I want to make is, I think your initial point, Harvey, about the inner fence, and that we really have to look to our experience of all these conditions to inform us about where we go from here, and not jump so quickly, especially in the law, and that we really inform the process. Maybe that will mitigate against some of these dangerous laws that you described to us, that were a reflection of the society at the time, and without real in-depth analysis. So that's the only point I wanted to make. Points.
I think it's Jonathan again. I think it's a really important point. Just so everybody on the line is aware, and some of you are physicians, and in everything we do on a daily basis, our job is to sort of assess capacity in various ways, shapes, or forms. And and we're not given very much training in that. In fact, if I am not a MAID assessor and I don't do MAID capacity assessments, but I could do it tomorrow if somebody asked me to do that, but you don't need training to do so. And I think, so just echoing Rose's point here, it's a really slippery slope that we're given a lot of training in other parts of medicine, not a whole lot of training in this part of medicine, although we're asked to do this every day and asked to make very serious decisions based upon those assessments.
Jonathan, I just, to my surprise, looked at the watch. It's 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
For my part, we can carry on if people would like to for a while, but I don't want people to feel constrained.
I'd love to keep talking, but I got to go. And thank you. Really a wonderfully informative experience. Thank you so much for making it available to us.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, and Lashana Tova, Rose.
Harvey, I have 2 little ones at home. I can transfer over to you as the host if you'd like, and I can if people want to.
Let me just see what the sentiment of the group is. Sure, I'm glad to have that happen. Can I have a show of hands of how many people would like to carry on for a little bit? And there's no way you can offend me with your vote.
We have to leave too, but I have a question I have to ask Dr. Zapersky. Are you related to Alvin?
It's the question everybody always asks me. Alvin is my grandfather.
You're joking.
Oh dear.
I know him
both
from
knew
Winnipeg.
your grandfather.
I know.
Yes, most people do know my grandfather.
Yes. Oh,
That's it. I'm closing
lovely.
with the same question I beat.
That was exactly the question.
The first question that Harvey asked me as well.
That's right.
Lovely. Lovely.
So listen, I think what we should do is draw this to a conclusion. I am grateful for having the opportunity to be with you and to learn from you. This is an issue of biblical proportions.
Yeah.
And it isn't going to be solved anytime soon. We're going to be living and learning and struggling with this one for a long time. And may we all have good health and a good year, and who knows, maybe an opportunity to talk about this again another time.
That would be good.
That'd be great.
All right.
Thank
So
you all. It's been a pleasure.
Provoking discussion. Very much appreciated.
Yeah.
All
Thanks,
right.
Harvey. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks,
Thank
Harvey.
you.
Thank you.